Elizabeth Short dreamed of Hollywood lights, but the marquee that would forever carry her name was the one that branded her death. The Black Dahlia. Her murder in 1947 turned Los Angeles into a city of whispers, detectives, and false confessions. And more than 70 years later, it remains one of the most hotly debated unsolved crimes in American history. One morning in January 1947, a quiet neighborhood in Los Angeles became a crime scene that would haunt the nation. Local resident Betty Bersinger was walking her 3-year-old daughter to a nearby errand when she spotted what looked like a mannequin lying on an empty, grassy lot along South Norton Avenue. She walked closer and realized it was a naked young woman lying on her back, her body grotesquely cut in half at the waist and drained of blood, her skin unnaturally pale. Her hands were raised above her head, with elbows bent at right angles, and her legs were spread apart, as if staged for display. Her mouth had been slashed from ear to ear in a brutal Glasgow smile, and her face was cut in a way that made it look like she was frozen mid-smile. The killer had also washed her body before leaving it in that vacant lot, as though trying to erase any trace of the crime scene, and instead present something more like a macabre art piece. When the police arrived, the details only deepened the horror. Medical examiners determined that Elizabeth Short had been dead for about 10 hours, placing her murder sometime between the evening of January 14th and the early morning of January 15th, 1947. The precision of the cuts, especially the bisection at the waist, suggested someone with medical training, or at least intimate knowledge of anatomy. There were no obvious defensive wounds to internal organs, indicating that the killer had worked carefully, almost surgically, to separate the body while leaving internal structures intact. The case quickly exploded into a media frenzy. Newspapers across the country picked up the story, and the Los Angeles press began calling her the Black Dahlia, a nickname that played off both her dark hair and her habit of wearing black clothing. The term stuck, transforming Short from a young woman into a symbol of Hollywood glamour, gone twisted and grotesque. 9 days after her body was found, an envelope arrived at the Los Angeles County Examiner's office. Inside were Short's social security card, her birth certificate, photographs of her, and an address book with several pages ripped out. The police noticed right away that the envelope had been cleaned with gasoline, just like the killer had apparently cleaned parts of Short's body. Partial fingerprints were lifted from the envelope and sent to the FBI, but the prints were compromised in transit and could never be properly matched. The return address on the envelope was composed of letters that had been cut out from movie advertisements, pasted together to spell out a fake name, as if the killer wanted to taunt investigators with a theatrical flourish. Over the course of the investigation, police received more than a dozen anonymous letters, many signed with the name Black Dahlia Avenger. These letters varied in tone. Some seemed to mock the police, others claimed inside knowledge of the crime, and a few even tried to direct the investigation toward specific suspects. The LAPD released a flyer with a photo of Short in an effort to generate tips, and hundreds of people came forward, some to offer help, others to confess outright to the murder. Around 500 individuals would eventually claim to have killed the Black Dahlia, including people who were not even alive when she died. The brutality of the crime and the cleanliness of the cuts led investigators to focus on a very specific circle of suspects, people with medical training. Hundreds of men were questioned, and nearly 300 medical students were investigated by the FBI, but nothing definitive ever surfaced. The LAPD even obtained a warrant to search the USC Medical School, located close to the vacant lot where Short's body was found, on the theory that whoever had severed her might have had access to cadavers, sinks, or other facilities where such a dissection could be done. Still, the case remained frustratingly open. Elizabeth Short herself was not just a tabloid headline. She was a real woman with a complicated life story. Born on July 29, 1924, in Boston, as one of 5 daughters to Phoebe and Cleo Short, She grew up in a family that was shattered by the 1929 stock market crash. Her father disappeared, leaving his car abandoned on the Charlestown Bridge, and his family assumed he had died by suicide in the Charles River. The household moved to Medford and barely made ends meet, with her mother working as a bookkeeper. Elizabeth suffered from asthma and had lung surgery at age 15. Doctors advised her to move to a milder climate to avoid respiratory problems, so her mother sent her to Miami, Florida, where she stayed with relatives. In 1942, her mother received a letter from her supposedly dead husband explaining that he was alive and living in California. Elizabeth eventually moved out west to be with him, drifting through towns such as Vallejo and Lompoc before settling in California. By July 1946, she had arrived in Los Angeles, where she rented a room behind the Florentine Gardens nightclub on Hollywood Boulevard and worked as a waitress while chasing her dream of becoming a movie star. Those who knew her described Elizabeth, or Betty, as friends called her, as striking, ambitious, and somewhat mysterious. She had a flair for fashion and liked to dress in black, which helped cement the nickname the press later gave her. She moved through a world of soldiers, salesmen, and aspiring actors, often staying with friends or acquaintances and building a modest little black book of contacts. That address book would later appear in the envelope sent to the Examiner, its missing pages fueling speculation about lovers, enemies, or accomplices she may have crossed. The last person Elizabeth was firmly known to have spent time with was Robert "Red" Manley, a 25-year-old married salesman and former Army musician who had begun dating her. Manley told police that he had given Short a ride after meeting her near a bus station and that they had stayed together in a hotel in Pacific Beach. He claimed he drove her back to Los Angeles and dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel on Grand Avenue on the evening of January 9th, where she was supposed to meet her sister, who was visiting from Boston. Staff at the Biltmore later recalled seeing Short using the lobby phone, and she was reportedly seen again at a nearby lounge about 800 meters away from the hotel. After that, there were no confirmed sightings until her body was found in the vacant lot more than 5 days later. Manley was arrested and held for several days, subjected to intense interrogation, polygraph tests, and background checks. The police ultimately found no solid evidence linking him to the murder, and he was released. He would die years later, in 1986, on the same date that he had last seen Elizabeth alive, January 9th, falling from the balcony of his apartment in Anaheim. His death did nothing to bring closure to the case, only adding another eerie layer to the timeline surrounding the Black Dahlia. As the investigation dragged on, the number of suspects grew and shrank in waves. Detectives sifted through hundreds of alibis, traced phone calls, and chased down tips from people who swore they had seen Short with various men in the days before her death. Some of these suspects were men who had dated her briefly, others were soldiers or servicemen she had met while working in Los Angeles, and still others were local figures with criminal histories or reputations for violence. None of the evidence ever stuck. One former detective, Ralph Asdell, claimed on the 50th anniversary of the murder that he had interviewed the actual killer. He described a man who had been seen driving a black sedan near the vacant lot where Short's body was found, and whose car had recently been repainted in a way that matched witness descriptions. Asdell said he became convinced that he had spoken to Short's murderer, but without concrete proof, he could never move forward. That confession, from the detective's perspective, remained locked in his own memory, another unverifiable thread in the tangle of theories. Another figure who surfaced in the maelstrom of speculation was Joseph Dumais, sometimes spelled Dumas, a man who claimed to have been blackout drunk with Short a few days before her body was discovered. When questioned, he acknowledged knowing about the murder, but military records showed he was stationed at his base on the day Short was killed, giving him an alibi. Still, his admissions and the fact that he claimed to have seen her alive while in a drunken stupor added to the rumors that he might have known more than he was saying. The Black Dahlia case also became entangled with the shadow of other murders. Between 1934 and 1938, the so-called Cleveland torso murders in Ohio had gripped the country, involving the dismemberment and mutilation of several victims. In 1947, Detective Peter Marilow, who had worked on the Cleveland killings, looked at Short's case and believed he saw a connection in the precise, almost artistic way the body had been cut and posed. That connection was later dropped due to lack of hard evidence, but the idea of a traveling torso killer latched into the popular imagination whenever the Black Dahlia was discussed. By the 1980s, a new lead emerged when a Los Angeles detective named Steve Hodel began re-examining the case from a deeply personal angle. His own father, George Hodel, a wealthy Los Angeles physician and former LAPD homicide detective who had worked on more than 300 murder cases. Steve believed that George had been not only capable of killing Elizabeth Short, but also had the means and mindset to turn her murder into a kind of performance. George Hodel ran a venereal disease clinic in Los Angeles, treating everyone from sex workers to members of the city's elite, giving him access to a dark underbelly of the city that few people saw. He was also a man with a fascination for art and surrealism, particularly the work of Man Ray, whose photographs and sculptures often featured distorted, posed, and bisected figures. Steve Hodel pointed out that the way Short's body was arranged, cut in half, arms raised, legs spread, echoed the imagery of surrealist art, and argued that his father had literally tried to turn murder into an artwork. After George's death in 1991, Steve began digging into old files, photographs, and police records. He claimed to have found photos that appeared to show his father with Elizabeth Short, and he argued that the handwriting on some of the Black Dahlia Avenger letters matched George's handwriting as analyzed by forensic experts. He also pointed out that George drove a 1936 Packard, a car that had been described by witnesses near the crime scene in the early hours of the morning. Perhaps the most disturbing allegations came from George's own daughter, Tamar Hodel. She described a childhood filled with fear and exploitation, accusing her father of sexually abusing her from a young age, attempting to involve her in illicit acts, and even arranging situations where she was offered to his friends. When she became pregnant at 15, she gave birth to a daughter, Fauna, who was given up for adoption. Decades later, Fauna would discover that her biological father and grandfather were the same man, and that George Hodel was directly tied to her own life story. Tamar's accusations were so severe that they led to a formal incest investigation, but George was ultimately found not guilty, in part because he was the one who provided the information, and several family members testified that Tamar was lying. Critics of the incest charges argued that the case was tainted by family feud and revenge, yet the allegations still painted a portrait of a man who saw his own family as little more than material for his own dark fascinations. By the late 1940s, George Hodel had moved to the Philippines, where another gruesomely posed body was discovered in 1950, bisected and placed in an empty lawn, echoing the positioning of Elizabeth Short's corpse. The site was less than half a mile from Hodel's home, and the similarity in staging fed into the belief that he had simply moved his art from one crime scene to another rather than abandoning the pattern. Years later, reporter Steve Lopez was granted access to sealed jury files and discovered that George Hodel's photograph had appeared among 21 other suspects considered by the LAPD. He also learned that the police had installed listening devices at Hodel's home and recorded him for about 40 days, hoping to capture a confession or incriminating statement. According to records, Hodel had such a detailed understanding of the LAPD's inner workings, especially its ties to the nightlife and prostitution underworld, that he was able to anticipate and short-circuit their surveillance efforts, leaving the tapes empty or inconclusive. Some of the most chilling moments in those recordings came not from clear confessions, but from veiled taunts. According to investigators who listened, Hodel at one point said, "Supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead." Ruth Spalding, his former secretary, had died in 1945 under suspicious circumstances, officially ruled a drug overdose, and Hodel's comments about her death added to the belief that he had a pattern of covering up murders by turning them into closed cases. Theories about the Black Dahlia have multiplied over the decades. One author, Pugh Eatwell, argued that the murder was not committed by a lone killer, but by a small group of men, possibly a nightclub owner named Mark Hansen, a man named Leslie Dillon, and others, working together in a sadistic ritual. Others have pointed to the possibility of a copycat killer, or the idea that a disturbed individual used the newspaper's obsession with the case to act out violence in the public sphere. Another bizarre twist came in the 1990s from Janice Knowlton, then in her 50s, who claimed she had witnessed her father, George Knowlton, kill Elizabeth Short when she was only a child. In her book, Daddy Was the Black Dahlia Killer, Knowlton described her father suffocating Short in the garage of their Westminster home, then cutting her body in the sink before forcing her to help him dispose of the remains. The story was widely criticized by investigators and family members, including Knowlton's stepsister, who said she had lived with George Knowlton for 16 years and found the narrative inconsistent with the facts of the case. Detectives also pointed out that the timeline, location, and method described in the book did not match the known evidence recovered from the Los Angeles crime scene. What remains fixed, despite all the theories and confessions, is that Elizabeth Short's murder is still officially unsolved. The Black Dahlia case has become a cultural touchstone, spawning books, films, TV shows, and endless internet speculation. The precision of the cuts, the theatrical staging of the body, the handwritten letters cut from movie ads, and the hundreds of false confessions have all fed the myth. For the city of Los Angeles, Elizabeth Short's death is a permanent scar. The headlines of 1947 still echo in the way the phrase Black Dahlia is used in true crime discussions, symbolizing both the vulnerability of a young woman trying to make her way in Hollywood and the corrosive power of media sensationalism. And on the grassy lot along South Norton Avenue, where Betty Bersinger once mistook a human body for a mannequin, the memory of that January morning lingers. An unsolved riddle, 70 years old, and counting. Thank you so much for watching. If this story moved you, if it made you think, please leave a comment below. Share your thoughts. Like and subscribe if you're new here. We cover true crime stories like this every single week, and I promise you, we never take them lightly. This is more than entertainment. These are real people, real families, real grief.